So to pick up on the themes that we were talking about in the first part of this lecture, these two kind of strains or movements in design culture, art culture, do we kind of celebrate the technological achievements, the kind of good things that are happening after World War II, or has World War II kind of scared us so much or horrified us so much that we look at all of the technology, all of the industrialization that's gone on as, or look at it a little bit more skeptically, and try to make architecture, make buildings that sort of truthfully relate the kind of mixed nature of it. These two poles, Brutalism and Precisionism, really get to a much, much larger idea that confronts building in the 20th century. And this is not just architectural theory. This is also like, what's the nature of engineering, right? What's the nature of industrial production? This goes back to a philosophical strain that we've talked about a little bit, the idea between the difference between a sort of rationalist idea where we have a vision of a building and we sort of design that and it trickles down into the details, or do we start with the details and build our way up? And the former is very much the Beaux-Arts strategy, where you begin with this mathematically rigorous diagram, the theory informs the detail. And this is at least resonant with continental philosophy, which believes in the ideal, believes that that there is this kind of world of ideas out there that governs us, and going back to Plato, that our that what we do here on Earth is always the kind of imperfect manifestation of that, but always inspired by it. The philosophical opposite to this is empiricism, and we mentioned the phrase "new empiricist" that Banham tried to use for Brutalism, but quickly got swamped by a slightly more headline-grabbing term. And this really relates to traditions in British philosophy, where you think about the whole as the sum of its details, and that the accumulation of those details or the building up of those details is what in architecture gives you the kind of aesthetic. So if you think about, for instance, the one of the arts and crafts houses that we looked at, the idea that you kind of start with an assemblage of program and an assemblage of materials, and you kind of build those up until you get something that begins to cohere, and then your job is basically to sort of tell that story. Empiricism has this tradition of kind of skepticism, of trying to only deal with what can be proven by experience, and is largely Aristotelian, right? It goes back to Aristotle instead of to Plato. Okay, so that's a philosophical backdrop. In architectural history, and also in the history of science and technology, we've seen this play out. The St. Peter's debacle, where the idea of quadrature sort of fails when it gets to something the size of St. Peter's Dome. This is exactly the kind of shortcoming of that rationalist idea, the continental philosophy idea, that if you understand the theory, then you can figure kind of everything out from there. We saw that it didn't work, although, in fairness, Polanyi's rescuing of St. Peter's Dome was based also on theory, on a mathematical model. We might contrast that, say, with the Crystal Palace, where the whole building is basically the sum of thousands of the same detail, right, replicated over and over again. There is an overall idea about the transept that comes later. The system is malleable enough to take that on board. But the form of the Crystal Palace could be almost anything, right? You could stretch those details out for another half mile, or you could make it twice as wide. The idea is that there is a collection of details that forms a system, and it just kind of stops when you run out of building, right, or run out of program. Brutalism, I would argue, suggests a continuing of that empirical strain, right? In other words, we're looking at the stuff that we make buildings out of, we're looking at the range of problems that we have to solve, and we're inching towards a solution by kind of matching those together. What the Smithsons do that I think is kind of brilliantly in tune with the kind of philosophy of the day is that they then realize that you can turn that, right? You can turn the sort of struggle to match contingencies of program with contingencies of available materials. You can turn that into an aesthetic, right? A ready-made aesthetic, but a consistent and coherent aesthetic nevertheless. Precisionism, on the other hand, suggests the opposite, right? That we are aiming towards something that is kind of perfect form, and our detailing is all about trying to make that form read, right? Not calling attention to the sinks, not calling attention to the pipes, but rather putting the emphasis on the platonic solids, the platonic geometries that these buildings tend toward. I want to look at three designers where I think these themes are both relevant and I think in some cases governing, where they're going back and forth really between this idea of pure form, pure experience, rendered in details that are trying to get all of the contingencies out of the way so that we get the ideal form instead, but also looking at the kind of facts of the case and realizing that there is an aesthetic possibility within those as well. These buildings, I think, are complicated, but they set the stage then for what we'll talk about in the next couple of lectures, right? What does it mean to be structurally expressive or technologically expressive? And I think that throughout, the common thread is Banham's idea of bloody-mindedness, of whatever approach you take, you're going to push it all the way to the limit, right? The building is going to be the result of the process, and we are going to see that process. And this, I think, approaches, anyway, a sort of experimental method, at least in its intensity and skepticism, if not in its kind of garnering of completely reliable knowledge at the end. So we've looked at a couple of familiar designers already, Corbusier and Mies. I want to look at a couple others who may not be as familiar, but who I think take these ideas or the conflicts between these ideas much, much further. The first is a California architect named Craig Ellwood. Ellwood is actually from Texas. He's actually not named Craig Ellwood. He's born Johnny Burke, and he reinvents himself. He moves to Los Angeles, works in construction, works initially with steel in the 1940s, and begins to put himself out as an architect based on his construction experience. So not particularly trained as a designer. And this, I think, is the ultimate kind of empirical approach, right? Someone who comes from the job site and realizes that you can order all of the kind of pieces that he sees on a job site in ways that have greater or lesser aesthetic impact. So very early on in his career, he begins to meet people. He meets, among others, the folks who are doing the case study house program, Arts and Architecture, and its editor, John Intenza. And Intenza commissions one of these houses from Ellwood, right? Off the job site, obviously a pretty smart kid. And Intenza gives him this hillside site above Beverly Hills. And Ellwood's philosophy is that the steel is like a kit of parts, and that you can put these kind of found components together right out of the catalog, but you can do it in ways that are either kind of expressive or not. And you can see that there's very clearly the influence of Mies in that these buildings are all going to have this very, very insistent, really almost classical rhythm to them. They're going to have these platonic kind of forms, right? These very, very crisply detailed rectangular forms. But when you get close to them, and you look in particular at the details on the lower right, you can see that Ellwood is very content to let you see the raw nature of the material itself, to see the actual steelwork, to have the details be so simple, right, so straightforward that there's no kind of dissembling or hiding anything. Everything is sort of on display. And I think this is a recipe that we see in Mies's buildings at IIT, if not the Farnsworth House, where if you squint at it, it's a Platonic building, a pure form, a precisionist idea. If you get up close and start to actually touch it, you realize that it's also brutalist, or at least empiricist, right? Using materials that are as found. And Elwood does a number of these case study houses. They are inexpensive because they are using sort of factory-made materials. They're using them off the shelf. And as you can see, he's found very, very simple ways to put them together. So he becomes very popular as one of the case study, quote-unquote, architects. And he's able to do these in a way that the spaces within really do have this kind of architectural quality to them. Even though the materials might be cheap, factory-made, they are put together in an ordered way where you get this contrast between pure space on the one hand and then the very sort of toothy, textured feel of the materials on the other. Worth saying, these are in Los Angeles, so Elwood is not dealing with the issues of water and insulation and condensation and things that we would deal with here in the Midwest. That certainly helps in terms of the simple detailing. And the case study program as a whole really adopts this ethic wholesale, and Elwood is only maybe the most rigorous applier of this sort of combination of precisionist forms and brutalist materials. Joseph Eichler is a developer who builds hundreds of suburban homes throughout the San Francisco and Los Angeles area on case study principles. So very pure rectangular forms, but then with things like rolled steel as part of the residential aesthetic, right, as part of the interior itself. And maybe the most famous case study house is this one by Pierre Koenig, overlooking Los Angeles. So he's gifted with a truly great site. And as you can see, this is very much a kind of Farnsworth house cantilevered out of the mountain, right? The detailing is all very crisp, very pure, but notice that when you're outside, you see the concrete slab, you see the concrete girders, and you get the sense that the windows, even though they are a little honed, are also kind of factory made, right, and presented as such. On the other side of the Atlantic, James Sterling is a figure who does very, very similar things, albeit with a different palette of material. In Los Angeles, you can use raw steel and lots of glass because of the climate. In a colder and damper climate, architects, especially doing housing, are confronted with a slightly different set of programmatic and performance requirements. Sterling, though, does this thing of taking the kind of pure, crisp forms and rendering them in raw materials. So aspiring both toward the kind of precisionist notion, but also toward the brutalist experience. This is an early project of his in the upper left, where you can see that the building is lifted up. This is a school project. The building is lifted up from the plaza. So that, remember Scully talking about the kind of very tense relationship with the landscape. You can see the very precise order, right? A rigorous, almost kind of classical order. In the lower right, you see an early housing project by Sterling, though, where the brick is laid up in ways that are, frankly, kind of sloppy, right? Intentionally sloppy. And Sterling wants the texture of that brick to read as you get up close to the building. So the visual experience is one of kind of purity and precision. The tactile experience is one that is almost kind of aggressively brutal. One of his more famous buildings, an academic building at the University of Leicester for the engineering department that he does in 1959. And you can see here that it's not a classical order, but it's a very, very functionalist order. He has separated the classroom building from the lab block, from the production block, from the office tower. And that means that you are reading the kind of pure program as you're far away from it. But then he's used materials that are off the shelf, right? Patent glazing, industrial glazing, the sawtooth windows that you see over the production spaces are right out of the kind of factory design handbook. And brick and tile that are used in ways that are maybe not quite as aggressively raw as in a building by Corbusier or in some of Sterling's earlier work, but nevertheless a material palette that's very much kind of as struck, right? Plain, what we get from the factory we put onto the building. And Sterling would go on to do a number of projects that really looked at expressing the industrialized nature of construction while also playing around with these ideas of much more evocative, sometimes classical form. And here you see in 1972 a building for Olivetti, the Italian design company, where he's using fiberglass, right, a very, very contemporary material, but he's using it in ways that both create these kind of crisp edges, no corner details if you round the corner, which is one way of making crisp, precise details, but also starting to play formal games in ways that make the building almost look like an industrially designed product instead of something that's built raw on site. And Sterling will move more and more in that direction, right? More and more polished, more and more precisionist, less and less brutalist as he goes into his late career and becomes one of the leading postmodernist figures in the United Kingdom. The last designer that I want to look at in at some length because Louis Kahn is one of these figures who is everything to everybody. The postmodernists see him as a leading kind of father figure of their movement. As I want to show, Kahn was very influential on the so-called high-tech movement. He was seen as a modernist, as a classicist, as a postmodernist, as a materialist, all of these things. And I think one of the reasons for that is that as much as anyone else, Kahn exemplifies this kind of complicated relationship between rationalism and empiricism. Right? Do we start with a theory and use that to tell us what the details should be? Or do we start by being fascinated with the materials and the components and the details and build those up into an overall meaningful building? And Kahn, I want to argue, does both, right? In his design process, which frustrated clients to no end because it would go on and on and on until he thought he'd come up with the ideal solution. He talked about going from the measurable to the immeasurable and back to from the immeasurable to the measurable and back to the immeasurable. In other words, yes, you do start with big ideas, with big theories. You have to translate those, though, into things that you know about the real world, whether that's structure or construction or fabrication. But the end goal to Kahn is always to come up with moments like this at the Salk Institute that you see on the left, where all of these kind of very humble materials, all of these kind of, in some cases, off-the-shelf components get marshaled into these experiences that are, in some cases, truly spiritual, right? Really, really emotionally resonant. Kahn trained as a classicist under Paul-Philippe Cret, one of the great American Beaux-Arts professors who taught at Penn. So he comes up in this Beaux-Arts tradition. You start with the overall scheme and you trickle down to the details later. But he was from a relatively poor family from North Philadelphia. So when he goes out on his own and opens up his own firm, he has to take these very, very kind of budget-conscious, low-paying jobs. And he does a lot of social buildings, housing, does work for hospitals, et cetera, things that don't give him a whole lot of room for grand Beaux-Arts plans, but force him to be very, very careful and to look in particular, to look at how materials are sourced, how they go together, how much they cost, et cetera, et cetera. He was hugely influenced by first-generation modernism. Corbusier, he said outright, was one of his heroes, and he taught at both Yale and Penn over over his career. And as we'll see, we think of him sometimes as this really spiritual architect. We think of him sometimes as this kind of latently classicist architect. But he was absolutely fascinated by building technology. And his office was full of people who really had their finger on whatever the latest techniques were. He worked closely not only with engineers and contractors, but also with fabricators to figure out what the capabilities of materials were and how those could be put to the programmatic ends that he was faced with. And as I said, like, he has a little bit of everything, right? So some of these buildings will look very classical if we squint at the plans. They will look very precisionist when we look at some of the glazing details in particular. But we'll also look at surfaces and elements where Kahn was very happy to have the materials show up on site and be expressed in really raw fashion. So as I said, his early career was largely taken up with public or social projects. One of the more interesting ones was one that he did with George Howe, who was chair at Yale, and Oscar Stonorov, an immigrant architect in Philadelphia. Among others, the three of them worked on workers' housing for wartime factory workers in just outside of Philadelphia. This is Carver Court, a completely unremarkable public housing project, except that it is very conscious of the way that the automobile is going to be part of post-war housing in particular. And also, as you look at it, very, very raw materials, clapboard siding that's stained, not painted, factory windows that have come right off of the kind of shop floor, concrete supporting walls, all detailed with very, very crisp, like elegant corners, right? So the details kind of disappear. And even in the kind of perching this above the landscape, I think you can see that if the materials are raw, the formal ambitions are not. And this is a great, I think, blending of precisionist and brutalist ideas in very, very early work by Kahn. While he's doing this wartime work, he is also part of the movement that is thinking about the issue of monumentality. How do we, once the war is over, build new cities that clearly are going to rely on this new technology, right? We're going to not build the giant neoclassical palaces that we used to in a new social era, but we need to have some way of representing our kind of coming together, right? Our civicness. And Kahn writes an article called Monumentality, where he argues for the expression of scientific principles, where he says that, if we can't sort of go back to ancient details and ancient kind of imagery, then we have to look forward. And if we look forward, we can sort of extrapolate from the advances that we've seen around us that science is going to be one thing that we all kind of agree on, and that really forms the basis for our aesthetic expression. On the left, this is Kahn's vision of a cathedral, and he says this basically is Beauvais Cathedral. You may remember from the Gothic lecture the last of the giant cathedrals that was never finished and in fact partly collapsed. And he said, the tragedy of Beauvais is that they didn't have the steel that we have, and we can mold that steel into very, very efficient forms that will also be expressive. And this is his idea of a Gothic cathedral, a spiritually resonant space that gets its resonance not from kind of the ornament and sculpture and play of divine light that the original cathedrals did, but rather from the kind of true expression of science, right? That the beams or the arches here are shaped in ways that Kahn says are structurally appropriate. Whether they are or not is a good question. They're going to be lightly ornamented, lightly detailed, but basically the steel is going to speak for itself, and the structural form is going to speak for itself. And this, I think, puts Kahn in a really interesting light, right? He was interested in technology. He was interested in engineering. This is Kahn in his office, and the two figures I want to point out in the back is a gentleman named David Wisdom, who was really the kind of technical brain of the office. And stories about the office include Wisdom going out to factories or meeting with manufacturers, getting catalogs and books on whatever the latest material was. Wisdom knew about aluminum, knew about extrusions, knew about how to break shape stainless steel in ways that, as we'll see, apply to some of the really crisp detailing that the office used. So to have someone like that in the office, I think, tells you something about what Kahn valued. The other person who you may have heard more about is Anne Griswold Ting, the woman in the foreground, who came to Kahn's office from the New York office of Conrad Wachsmann, one of the early space frame innovators, and really kind of challenged Kahn. The two of them were romantically linked. If you've seen the movie My Architect, you may know that whole story. I'm more interested here in what Ting brought to the office in terms of structural geometry, right, from, in part, Wachsmann's office. Ting, to my mind, is the ultimate kind of precisionist, interested in mathematics, interested, as we'll see, in kind of big theories that trickle down to details. Wisdom, I think, is the ultimate brutalist, right? The ultimate, like, let's look at what the materials can do and let's use those to form the kind of expressive palette of the building that we're working on. With Ting, Kahn designs a couple of houses first, the Weiss House on the right, and a demonstration design never built for Libby Owens Ford to look at how you would use glass in a way that was appropriate as a kind of solar benefit. Very, very forward-thinking competition. As you can see, Kahn and Ting kind of know what they're doing. Overhangs that put most of the glass into shadow. Thermal mass, look at that stonework. That maybe reminds you of the Shaker barn that Scully thinks is one of the ultimate precisionist models. Overall, very, very simple, pure forms. But when you look closely, very raw materials, right? The stone and the wood are both expressed, even if they're expressed in ways that are tailored, right? The surfaces are all very, very kind of toothy. After years of doing public housing and hospitals and finally single-family houses, Kahn gets the kind of commission of a lifetime. Yale asks him to do the new art gallery building on their campus. And Kahn and Ting basically do the project together. This is the building on the left, and it's often cited as an example of brutalism, right? These solid walls, it's a museum, so you don't want a whole lot of daylight, and the walls are just simply laid brick with little precast or limestone elements showing you where the floor slabs are, but not much more, right? That's most of the exterior. It's the interior, though, that's most interesting and that became, of course, most famous. On the right, you see a very, very early sketch where if you look on the third floor, you can see that Kahn and Ting are thinking about this building as a very, very simple concrete loft. They're putting reflectors into the lower floors to where they anticipate galleries needing lighting. But you can see that it's a very, very simple set of concrete beams, basically. And here, an early version of it, you can see that the beams are designed with holes in them so you can weave the ductwork through them. And the gallery, the museum, is divided into two galleries on opposite sides of a circulation core, or very kind of basic stairs for both communication and for fire exiting. They go on with this scheme up through kind of the first client approvals, and after everything gets okayed, Ann Ting takes Kahn aside and berates him and basically says that, you've done you have the commission of a lifetime here, and you've done kind of a dumb concrete box. And she says, having worked with Wachsmann, she had ideas about how space frames could be used in sort of non-traditional settings. And she says, I just did this competition for an elementary school. We used a space frame. This seems to me like a much more radical idea, but also one that, maybe could actually be cheaper, right? Or easier to assemble. And she recalled Kahn sort of looking at this model and poking pencils through it, realizing that the ductwork could just run through the interstices of the space frame and wouldn't have to go through the girders as we saw in the previous drawing. So Kahn calls Yale and says, hold everything up. We think we have another idea. The overall mass of the building is going to stay the same, but the interior is going to be developed as a set of these tetrahedral space frames. Ultimately, it can't be done in steel. It's the middle of the Korean War. Steel is embargoed. And instead, Ting draws up a tetrahedral space frame in concrete. And you can see here her drawing where she is figuring out the very, very careful geometry to get the thing to work. The ceiling plan that they end up with becomes kind of iconic, right? This is one of the great buildings of the post-war era, and you maybe have seen this plan in other history courses. You can see that Kahn changes the main communicating stair to sort of honor the triangular geometry of the space frame that Ting has come up with. But you see, too, that there is this incredibly precise order to it, right? In plan, this is a precisionist building. In experience, that concrete is left raw. And as we saw in the exterior, the two of them are very willing to let the brick cladding speak very plainly for itself. And the materiality, the roughness, the raw nature of the concrete becomes really important to the way that the building is experienced. Again, going back and forth between the kind of rationalist ideas of precisionism, about simple geometry, about crisp details, about making you see the platonic form of the building, and brutalism, right? Being confronted with surfaces of raw, in this case, concrete or brick, and getting that kind of in-your-face nature of the material and the way that it's showed off. In the third part of the lecture, I want to look at Kahn's subsequent career. Yale certainly put him on the map as an important designer. And this mix of kind of pure forms, maybe even classical forms, advanced technology, raw materials, precise detailing, comes together in some of his later work in ways that I think really sum up a lot of what we've talked about in the last few weeks and help us turn the corner into the sorts of approaches that we'll see in the last few lectures here.